live link with us. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our next session on displacement, development-led displacement, in which we have our speakers with us who have joined us, Mr. Zishan Ali and Mr. Chaya Bhardwaj. Before stepping into introducing our speakers, I would like to briefly introduce ILA Sonipat before you all, and also ILA. So Indian Lawyers Association is a non-profit organization where we are an amalgamation of law students, academicians, as well as practitioners. And we also have our district chapters. One of the district chapter is in the Sonipat chapter. And we have been holding online events since the COVID time. And we hope to have offline events as well in the future. But meanwhile, we have shifted to the online platform. So we in the past we have had events specifically in the field of judicial justice as well as intellectual property. We also have our own intellectual property law committee. If any one of you are interested, join. I'll also drop in the details in the chat box at a later point of time. And today our next session is a little different from intellectual property law event. The events that we have been doing until now have been basically focused on intellectual property law. So we've thought to change a little bit, and we have kind of took a new topic, kind of related to transfer of property law, but also related to construction. So we have with us Mr. Zishan Ali, who is a civil engineer by profession. He has an experience of working with both Aditya Birla and EY. And while working with EY, he was also heading the FSSM project and also assisting the government of Odisha. So he has worked very closely and seen how development projects could lead to displacement, and how at the ground level we the contractors as well as the engineers deal with it. And we have with us Professor Chaya Bhardwaj, who is an expert in the field of climate and international law. She closely works on internal displacement as well as has taught courses on transfer of property law. So she is an expert with respect to the legal framework, and we listen from both of our speakers on this particular topic and on how development projects could lead to displacement and how to deal at different from different angles. So if I may now start with our kind of, I'll basically be moderating the session and posing questions to both our speakers, turning it into an interview pattern. At the end, we'll also have, and in the meanwhile, also any of our participants could very well chip in with your questions in the chat box. At the end, we'll have more questions from the join. So if I could start with my first question is to Mr. Zishan. So given your work experience in the field of construction, have you actually seen, how closely have you seen development projects leading to large scale displacement, or have you seen them actually displacing people?
Okay. Thank you for the introduction, ma'am. So, ma'am, coming to the first question of yours, while I was working with for the government, so I saw there were cases where people were either given some kind of compensation or none of them. So there was this case in Odisha, in a small district. So there was this burial ground. People used to bury the dead bodies of the loved ones there, and which was the government's place. It was so remotely located in the village, it has no road connection to it. So people thought it might be a land belonging to someone who's having his or his ancestors living there. So what happened is, when the government asked us to construct the project there, people started revolting that we are burying our people there, burying our family members there. How can you do this? How can you start it? So before starting with this, I'd like to also tell you that those people were Hindus. They were basically tribals, and they didn't have enough money to eat, or either enough money to do anything. Like, they struggled eating, they struggled a meal. They were very poor, they're very uneducated, they're very illiterate. So this was also a barrier for them. this is how the displacement began. Like on the first day, we saw revolt. 30 days, we saw some people coming and revolting us and stopping us from doing the work. Now, what happened? In initial days, steps were not taken. So, as 30 days passed, the contractor took this matter in his own hands, came and just gave 200 each to the people and 500 to the leader, and that's how the matter was shut down forever. And the construction is like completed.
Okay, so as you shared your experience, we want to know that generally these displacements are kind of seen in places where the inhabitants are not very educated or very well versed with the legal framework. And basically, it also leads to large scale displacement where a whole locality, and as you said, the burial ground, and people also have their emotions attached to that. Not only displacement cannot just be of one kind, that people or people's home are getting displaced. It's also like the place which they use for their daily usage, and place which they use for even burying their loved ones, which has emotional connection. That also, if it gets displaced, that also we can count as displacement. Most importantly, what you shared your experience, it leads us to our next question, which is my question to Professor Chaya. So can you tell us a little bit about what is the legal framework for these development projects? For example, the road development projects, or the project that Mr. Ali was working upon, the FSSM project, housing urban development project. What is a general legal framework? So the land acquiring process, etc. Could you just throw a general light about that?
Thank you for that question, Sani. Before answering your question, I would just like to highlight that the idea of development is something that has been brought at least to the Indian lands from the colonizers, or it is a very colonial concept. And therefore, how we see development today, development in terms of infrastructure or skyscrapers as residential or commercial buildings, or health centers, which are very modernized in nature, is an outcome of the modern technology and, of course, the industrialization that took place. So when the British were ruling India, they had a Land Acquisition Act, which was designed in the 1800s. And after 1800s, after India got independence, we followed the similar land acquisition process. Under that, what the government could do was that the government, in the name of development, and development would then mean building residential areas, commercial areas, or government offices, legislative buildings, roads, schools, so on and so forth. Under the name of these developmental projects, the government would be able to acquire the land and then may or may not give compensation to the owners of the land at that point of time. So the previous, or the British law that we had, did not have the compensation aspect to it. And therefore, in India in 2011, and even before 2011, in and around the dam construction projects that we had, particularly the Narmada Dam construction project, and the Narmada Bachao Andolan that was, later launched by Miss Medha Patkar and likes. After that developmental project, the development-induced displacement came to the highlight of the government and got attention of the government, like after that particular dam project. The reason why that happened, why the development-induced displacement came to limelight at that point of time, was that the farmers who were displaced and the farmers whose land was acquired by the government, they were given land in compensation, another land where these people were resettled, and that land was not of a farming quality land. So imagine a person, an indigenous farmer or a native farmer who has only known one skill throughout his life, which is farming around a very fertile land, was then displaced and sent to a land which did not have the qualities of being farmed at all, which was a rocky terrain. And they, in addition to this, they were also not given adequate compensation, meaning they were not given adequate money to be able to sustain themselves in the absence of the only livelihood skill that they had. So Medha Patkar and the likes, they went on against this government-induced development project, and we've seen that some effect happened because of the movement. But even today, we see that the developmental projects, when the government acquires the land, we still face challenges of questions like what the process is, what the compensation should be. And as Jishan highlighted, it is not just a matter of financial aspects or political aspect. It is also a matter of social and cultural aspect, wherein, say, if the land of the people is taken away, what about their culture? What about their gods? What about their burial areas, so on and so forth? So all of this is combined together. Today, we have the Land Acquisition Act of 2013, which plays a very important role in determining how it doesn't have the process of acquisition, but it defines on what grounds can the government take away the land. So the government can take away the land for public purpose. And the definition of public purpose is, again, very broad. It can include developmental projects pertaining to creation of schools, creation of hospitals, infrastructure development, roads, highways, so on and so forth. But the government can also take away the land to give it to corporations. So both of these are there, and it's a very, very wide ambit under which the government can actually take away the land in the name of development. Development, definitely one of the negative consequences of development is displacement. And if I can use the other terms for it, displacement is also known as forced migration. It means that the people are forced to move out of their native areas, and they're forced to move to areas where they might not even know people, they don't have the culture, or they don't have the skills to continue on with their lives, so on and so forth. I'll stop to that. Otherwise, it may be a very long answer. So this is my brief answer to the question that you asked. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. From the discussion we had right now, we understood that we have seen a shift from the British to the post-British era legal framework, where we started with no compensation. Then we shifted with compensation, but not a very clear process of acquiring mentioned in the Land Acquisition Act. And also, as you said, that it's one of the negative outcomes of development is displacement or forced migration. Let's hear from Mr. Zishan Ali. As Professor Shah said, that the process of acquiring is not very clear. Right, in the legal framework as well. So government and the government officials try to twist it and turn it and use it in their own ways, or use it as per their own understanding. Let's listen from Mr. Ali, how he could tell us more about the ground reality of the land acquiring process. Like, what is the role of tehsildars? What is the role of BDO, block development officer, things like that? Over to you, Mr.
So basically the acquisition comes in two types. Either government will own a property which is owned by any personal property, or it is already owned by the government and it is being used by personal purpose or any like locality or something. So in case of the personal one, if any project is to be done, the order comes from the government to the district magistrate. He orders the municipal corporation, and the municipal corporation moves ahead with the official paperwork of that land. He talks with the owner, and all the official work is done in that way. In case of government property, the order comes from the government. It comes through via the district magistrate to the municipal corporation, and then the municipal corporation moves to the tehsildar. Basically, the tehsildar have a possession of all the government land. So he is told to give a suitable land for the project. Now, any land which is being used for any purposes, he is supposed to remove that and he is supposed to allot that property to the municipal corporation. After that, the municipal corporation will hand over that land to the contractor to start with the construction. So this is basically the process.
So basically, the Tehsildar is the onlooker of all the land. He has records and he allots the land and tells the government that, okay, this land will be okay, good for the development, etc. So can you tell us more about what is the difference between road development projects and the project that you were, heading? For instance, what's the difference in the process or basically the need of the land?
See, the road development, we have basically agricultural land and houses. We can meet the owners and all. But that project which I was heading in, that was already owned or used by some people for hundreds of years for any other purposes like grazing or burial ground or something like that, or maybe drainage also. So in that case, removing of those things, those people are really, it becomes very difficult for us. The convincing becomes very difficult for us, because in the case of road, road is already like whenever we have to construct the road, basically we consider anywhere near the highway or something like that. People already know the expansion can happen in this way. So basically people leave area on that part. In case of this, like acquisition of land is easier in terms of road. But in terms of this, people are very reluctant to do. People have, like Chadi said, we have very cultural backgrounds and all. There are barriers. People are not willing to move to the land, no matter what. And even if we force them to move, there are certain cases where even if the project is constructed, people will not allow the project to start. They'll wait us to finish the project and they'll not allow the project to start. This is the way it happens.
Okay, so as you said, that it's easier to convince people and it's also easier to displace them when the project is something like road, and it's the pressure is more by the government and the inhabitants. They also kind of know that they are constructing their homes in an area which has not been allotted to them, so they are always under the fear of like someday or the other we might get evicted. But on the other hand, the project, the speakers, I'm sorry, could you please elaborate the project that you were working on?
It was basically a wastewater treatment plant. We used to treat sludge and wastewater. So basically, people were of the thought process that if it will be treated, it will have a lot of waste all around, which was not true, and it will have a lot of smell, which is also not true. So convincing this was also a difficult task for them.
All right. So the nature of project, like your project was on the treatment of fecal waste, and people were reluctant to give their land, specifically not the land in which they used to bury their loved ones. They were very reluctant. So this leads me to my next question to you, Mr. Ali. So how do you think? I mean, not think, but how do you officials at the ground level convince the inhabitants of the necessity? As you said, it's easier in the road development projects, other projects, but the projects like these, which are also development projects, but it's difficult to convince them. Also, because the inhabitants are not very literate. So do you also have language barriers and things like that?
So like we basically convince them in two levels. The first level is we'll convince them that if they will allow us to make that project, they will be getting like the market value of that area will increase. First is that. Second is they'll be getting continuous electricity. They'll be getting road connection. They'll be getting all kind of facilities which is available nearby the government projects. So it is beneficial for them. At second level, if they're not convinced with them, we basically provide them employment, like they can work in the project during the construction of project, and after the construction of project they will be employed. We give them a guarantee, and that is the last stage of it.
All right, so you told about the two different types of compensations that you try to give them. The first one is employment in the project itself, for example, workers. And the second one could be in the form of employment after a continuing employment contract, even after the project is completed. So there might be other projects in the area and they might be given employment. in this and in those projects. So this leads to my next question to Professor Chaya. So what Mr. Ali told was the ground reality of how they convince the inhabitants that these are the compensations that we may offer. Of course, so many of the times these inhabitants might just not be aware of the rate of compensation that they can receive from the government. Of course, not very aware of the process to claim that that compensation. Nevertheless, could you please summarize for us the legal framework for and they're getting compensation by any inhabitant who is displaced because of a development?
One of the challenges that we face, particularly in regard to compensation, is that there is lack of a clear criteria to understand what amount of compensation will be followed for what particular area of land. It is varied from place to place and project to project. Now, this is understandable that the circle rates of properties vary from place to place. So, say an area, 1 acre area of land in Delhi would be the rate of 1 acre area of land in Delhi would be very different from the rate of 1 acre area of land in rural India, say for example in Chhattisgarh or in Rajasthan. So because of these varied circle rates, the rates of compensation also vary. And so therefore, there is no clear criteria as to what amount of compensation the government will follow. Although in the current right to fair compensation for Land Acquisition Act, that is the Land Acquisition Act of 2013, there it is stated that if the government occupies 1,000 acres of land, then they will have to pay an amount of approximately 90 crores, or if I'm not wrong, it is 90 crores, or approximately 90 crores. And then it is distributed within or amongst the people who may or may not own the land. Now, so this is the biggest criticism, that there's no criteria on the basis of how compensation or what amount of compensation is given. Second problem with compensation is that it is in India, even today in rural areas, the claim to properties or the claim to lands is very irregular. So, I mean, somebody can be an owner of a land, but still not be a pattadhari, meaning not having a legal document for owning the land. Sometimes the person may just claim ownership of land out of right of adversity. So all of these challenges also exist in parallel to the lack of amount of compensation. What happens now is that due to this, another additional layer of complex challenge arises, which is that the government can't decide how many number of people is going to receive compensation if a particular area of land is taken away. Because say, for example, if a land is owned by a joint family, then the number of people who may receive compensation for that particular land may be high. So now, even if the government fixes the amount, the government can't fix the number of people who will receive compensation out of the area that they have acquired. So this is the second challenge to it. And then the third challenge to it is the problem that you've highlighted is awareness amongst the stakeholders about what is the amount that they can receive. Now, sometimes people who are not receiving even a meal a day, for them, for 1 acre of land, even 50,000 rupees of compensation would sound like a very huge amount of money. But if you look at it in the long run, it is not a huge amount of money. Similarly, if you look at people in Delhi NCR, they may not even be satisfied with 50 crore rupees for 1 acre of land, which is a very huge amount of money if we compare it, if we compare the two situations. And so therefore, the awareness faction becomes very important. And then the people the low-income communities or the vulnerable people become more vulnerable or more vulnerable to exploitation in such situations. And therefore, there's no straight-jacketed answer to this, again, due to lack of a uniform legal system in this area.
Thank you, Professor Chaya. This leads me to one point that Mr. Ali also highlighted, that these people, they said that they had been using that particular land for a long point of time. Right? Could you also pinpoint what did they claim, Mr. Ali? How much time had they been using it for? The specific burial ground that you talked about.
For that case, they were using it even before independence.
Okay.
23 years.
Okay. So it was kind of ancestral usage that they were using, like, from a lot of time. So, Professor Chaya, do you think that these inhabitants could have claimed that they kind of had an adverse possession on that land, because even though the land was registered in the name of government, but they were not stopped from using that land. They had been using it for a long time, as Mr. Ali said, even before independence. So could you say that they could have claimed adverse possession if they were legally aware?
So I'm not sure if the land area that Jishan is talking about is an area that could fall under the Forest Rights Act. So if it was to fall under the Forest Rights Act, the people could have claimed an ancestral or a historical right, because the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes are to be treated specially if they are claiming ownership of the land. So my answer to this question would be that yes, they could have claimed ownership to the land that the government said belonged to them. In one way could have been claim of adversity. Other claim could have been if they were scheduled castes or scheduled tribes, they could have also invoked certain rights under there. And then the third part would have been the Forest Rights Act, which would then again be complementary to the historical rights.
Thank you, Professor Chaya, for that answer. So, Mr. Ali, what actually was the claim of the inhabitants? Did they say that we are going to take a lawsuit against this, or did they just revolt, or were they given some compensation which they were happy with? As we have seen until now, that they are not aware of the actual rate. As Professor Chaya also said, that the people who are very, very poor, they will be happy with a meager amount. So, what actually is the case on the on-ground reality?
See, on ground, they were very illiterate. So basically, even if someone told that they have this kind of rights they can do, they can claim this kind of compensation, they couldn't have moved further because, again, financial issues they have to face. So they were claiming nothing. They were just saying, we will not allow you to construct this project because our family members are buried here at any cost, because we have our family members here buried. So this was the case.
And what did they also claim a compensation, or were they given a compensation?
No, they didn't claim any compensation. If they moved further, they might have been given compensation. If they moved further, this never reached the government. It was in contact of contractor. Like contractor stopped the work, waited for anyone to respond. Nobody responded. He just entered. He gave them basically compensation. In compensation, he gave them 200 rupees to the people who came and 500 to the leader, and that's it. It was done.
So that's a practical example of what Professor Chaya said, that not even 50,000 or a big amount, in thousands, hundreds is enough. And they were not even given employment in the project. Most of the time, they're not given employment, even though some of the contractors do offer them employment. Most of the times, it's just a very meager settlement. So this leads to my next question to you, Mr. Ali. So we talked about the times in which the inhabitants are illiterate, and it's easier to convince them because there are lesser revolts from their side with respect to legal framework. But of course, more revolt, as you said, on-ground revolt, they wouldn't let you move ahead, but then they settle with a meager amount. But then the things become difficult when the inhabitants are actually aware of the legal framework, as Professor Chai said, that inhabitants in Delhi, if they're displaced, so they wouldn't even settle for a good amount. They would want more because they're more legally more aware, more literate. So what is the technique or the mechanism that you as officials utilize to convince them, those inhabitants?
Basically, we meet the leaders, whoever is heading that group, and we talk. See, even if that property earlier belonged to the government, it was again from the tehsil that was transferred to the municipal corporation. So it was always a government body. Nobody was supposed to use it until they started using it. A building, that is another case. So government will start the construction at any cost. Like people have promised, the political leaders have promised that we will give you this project within this stipulated time. Now that promise will go wrong. So at any cost, that for construction of that project, people like the government can use the police forces to get it done. In that cases, the person who are revolting might not even give compensation, or something else can happen. So in that case, we say either like these are the things we can give to you, the other compensation we can give to you, because they see there is certain criteria that they can ask for compensation. They can't ask beyond that. Like Chaya ma'am said there are no decided boundaries, but we decide boundary that in we can give compensation in this specific criteria. Beyond it, we can't give. We cannot afford. So basically, if it falls in that boundary, we give it to them. If it does not, we can use government, like we can use police forces against, and we can get it done, the project done. So in either cases, they have to agree.
Okay, so you also elaborated how what Chaya said, that there is no set criteria, and how you those unclear criteria could be used, and how the contractors or how the officials, they try to set a particular amount of compensation, even if that amount is not mentioned in the statute itself, but on ground it's set by common consensus, and then it's presented to the leaders, as you said. Maybe if it's a village, it might be the Khap Panchayat, Gram Panch, so Sarpanch or other leaders, or if it's a tribal area, the tribal leader. So my next question is to Professor Chaya. So with respect to the legal response that is required in such situations, so what do you think could be the different kind of legal responses that an official or the contractor could face while dealing with these two cases? One in which the inhabitants are not educated, and how do they deal with their revolt legally if it escalates, and second, when the inhabitants are literate, how do the contractors or the officials on the ground level should deal with their responses? Their response legally, and how they should go ahead legally.
Oh, I actually would again, answer this question in two layers. First of all, I would take the case example of Jishan's work that he has been highlighting. So he's been saying that the case that he worked on was a burial ground. Now, the burial ground becomes distinctively different from a land where people are residing. So say, for example, if a burial ground is acquired, we are not talking about residents who will be displaced, but we are talking about displacement essentially of a cultural right, that they wouldn't be able to exercise their cultural right. So now here, the value of the amount of compensation that otherwise a resident would receive automatically is devalued. That's one thing in this particular case, because if I'm saying that while the residents are displaced because of a developmental project, even they don't receive adequate amount of compensation, people who like if a land belongs to post to the people who've demised, and for the residents not to actually reside there but to perform certain cultural rites, it will automatically devalue the value of compensation that they are to receive. In this particular case, Jishan also highlighted another aspect, which is that although these people were exercising their burial rights on this particular ground, these were also people who belonged to low-income communities, which puts them in the category of the most vulnerable people. This means they did not have adequate money to even have a meal for a day. Now, in such situations, it becomes all the more difficult for the officials and the leaders as well. So the leaders could be politically motivated, and they may also be corrupt. And if they are politically motivated and corrupt, it becomes very disadvantageous for the vulnerable communities themselves. Now, if the vulnerable community, if one member receives 200 rupees as compensation, it means they have at least received value for meal for one day, for not just for themselves, but for their whole family. Now, in such situations, I would like to highlight that people who are from low-income communities are most vulnerable because they would settle for a smaller amount of compensation or for a devalued compensation because they automatically do not have resources against people who live in more urban setup and they have basic amenities and basic resources, and they are not dependent on that money to fulfill their basic resources. So I think the legal framework to this, and I'm actually going more basic than just saying how to address the challenges of compensation in a development-led displacement. First of all, the government in low-income community areas should work towards providing basic amenities and reducing poverty. Of course, that should be the developmental goal of the government, instead of taking away the land, building huge infrastructure, properties, so on and so forth. This is also a criticism to the right to fair compensation or the Land Acquisition Act of 2013, that instead of focusing on building huge infrastructures, focusing on low-income communities and providing them with basic amenities might be a little bit more helpful. Secondly, there needs to be awareness generation programs and empowerment programs, because just awareness is not sufficient and just empowerment is also not sufficient, because the low-income communities, they can't feel empowered without having the support that they need from certain people. And so I think some of the pro bono lawyers or pro bono activists like Medha Patkar are more helpful in situations like these, who without any political motivations or corrupt motivations are willing to get fair compensation for these low-income communities or vulnerable communities. Thirdly, I think the government needs to uniformalize the compensation substantive and procedural aspect, meaning if the government is taking away land from any part of India, they should clearly state that this is the amount of money that they're going to give, and this is the process. One of the ways could be that they can move to an online system and appoint officers, maybe like Jashan, who can then assist and help these vulnerable communities in filing claims. Now, even in this system, the challenge of the number of people claiming compensation may be higher than the registered number of residents with the government. And I think this is a challenge we should accept, at least in India as a country, because we are one of the largest populations in the world and fastest growing populations in the world. And therefore, we should only recognize and acknowledge that these challenges are only going to increase and therefore allowing certain claims can only help low-income communities, although they might also help more resourceful people who may file false compensation or false claims under these schemes. But I would go with the claim if it's benefiting a larger population, then that may be the route the government may take. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And just a last question, which is to Professor Shah itself, is a very short question from one of our participants. Does the government also protect the traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expression along with their land rights? And is it a parallel common claim?
So, like I said, the forest, the traditional forest dwellers, they are protected by the government. But currently, we don't see any practice in India where there is an explicit protection of cultural practices. And I think there may be a need right now to integrate that as well. And I will add, with the increasing challenges of sea level rise, particularly, we have a lot of traditional knowledge at the verge of extinction, particularly in Lakshadweep and Andaman and Nicobar, where we have a lot of scheduled tribes residing. So I think right now there's a need to integrate that along with compensation and fair treatment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So my next question is to Mr. Ali. As Professor told about the different reforms that could be taken in the legal framework, she also told about shifting to an online system and having officials assist at both the offline as well as online system. Do you think that these legal reforms could actually work at the ground level? And second question to you is, what other practical, reforms from the lens of an official who has worked on ground would you suggest that would be helpful in the practical implementation, not just theoretical one?
Yes, what Shyam said, those reforms can work, but adding to that, if a designated employee was kept at a place, he couldn't have, like Shyam said, that finding the right person, like the claimers will be more. Finding the right person might be a challenge. So to meet those challenges, some processes might be developed, and that destination person should have a job to verify all those, verify the false and the true claims, and then he can move away with the process. Now that employee can also be given an additional job to work with. He can work with all of the processes that is involved in this compensation work. So his core job will basically be to meet all the requirements and to verify the document and get the compensation done. That's it.
Sorry, I was on mute. And what other reforms would you suggest? For instance, having an interpreter, as you said, language was also a barrier.
Yes, like there was an example in Odisha. They have interpreters also. They have people working for a specific job. So anyone who works for a specific job can have more efficiency. So in this case, if that interpreter also work as like designated person to get the compensation, that would be very beneficial.
And did you have an interpreter when you were working in that area, or were you struggling with the language?
In my case, I was struggling with the language. I basically used my contractor, who is also not good at Hindi. So he used to help me with the words.
So do you also feel that this language barrier also leads to could potentially, I'm not saying that it did in your particular case, but could potentially in other hypothetical cases lead to misguiding the inhabitants? So they actually, or just not just full communication with the officials. So they are saying something, you're understanding something, or you're just misleading them in a certain way because you know that they won't be able to understand what you are saying.
It does. It surely does. See, even if I am on the ground, I'll say something that includes also those things which the contractor, who is my interpreter, won't like. So he will omit those things and he will just convey the straight things. So it happens.
And you also told about certain revolts that these people often resort to. So and you said that at some time police force could also be included. Well, that's legally also correct, because police is also a part of the state itself, and it of course will intrude when there is any breach of peace and security. But are these revolts always violent, or are these revolts peaceful as well? For example, the people are just not letting you enter their land, or are they also evicting the officials out of their lands through violent means?
See, they are both the cases. One is they will openly accept it, this thing is going to happen. They will ask for a solution. They'll visit the municipal commissioner. They'll meet him. They'll ask for a solution or an alternate compensation. Another case is, even if some people get the compensation and they're not happy, if some part of them are happy and other part of them not happy, they will revolt. Even they will hinder the construction. Even after the construction is completed, they will hinder the work of the government. So in that case, people also, like, the commission orders or the government orders them to arrest them. This kind of thing happens.
And there's also a question from one of our participants who have joined us. I'm sure you would want to take this question. So what have you seen through your experience? Is the compensation paid only for the land owned by the people, or is it also paid, the compensation is also paid for land which is owned by the government but is being used by the people?
See, in kind of owned by the people, government has to pay the compensation. It is sure. But in case of that, the government-owned land which is used by the other people, in that case, if they move forward, if they ask for the compensation, then they are given compensation, but it's a very time-taking process, because the amount of the project is estimated, the amount of the land is estimated, but the amount of compensation is not estimated. That becomes a barrier. So in that case, when people ask for the compensation, they are simply told after the concession that they have a meeting with the district magistrate or they have a meeting with the commissioner, and they are told to resolve it. So also, if the compensation is also, one barrier is also coming. If the compensation is given to them, now there are chances that they won't be happy with the compensation. They won't be willing to have the compensation in that case. Or if because their compensation is given in terms of government land, and if government wants to construct any government project nearby, there are higher chances that they will obstruct the construction happening nearby them. So this is a very high case. So we have to look all the criteria before deciding the compensation.
So absolutely, and the specific case that you told, that they also would obstruct, of course, if anyone is being displaced, the first revolt that comes to any person's mind is self-defense, and one of that is, as you said, they would want to obstruct the construction. So just as we are coming to an end to our discussion, this one last opinion that I would want to seek from you is, do you think that, as Professor Chaz has said, that one negative impact of the development is this forced migration, so do you agree that there are a lot of land just lying out there unutilized by government? So we could avoid all of this by choosing the land more specifically, by making our development projects more flexible than asking people to leave their lands and give it to us for development. So just seeking your final remark.
No, it's not possible, because any land, they are agricultural land, they're non-agricultural land. So depending upon the usage, we decide, like, there is a pollution control board. That board decides whether this particular land is fit for it or not. We have a certain criteria, we have a certain area. It won't be possible we will get 2 acres or 4 acres of land at one place and at that location and everything that is following every criteria. It is not possible. If it's possible, there are cases where we have shifted to another land because the displacement was becoming tough for us, or taking time. There are cases, but if we're not getting, then we have to go for that particular land.
So as you said, this development in induced displacement is an inevitable event, will continue to happen. And that takes us to a closure of this discussion that we had with Mr. Zishan Ali and Professor Chaya. And we come to a conclusion that, as Mr. Ali said, that is development-induced displacement will continue to happen because there are such criteria that a land has to match when this has to be used for a development project, and then sometimes inevitably it will lead to displacement. And in that, what comes into play, what comes into picture is the recommendations that Professor Chaya put forth, and the follow-up recommendations that Mr. Ali told us about, the feasibility of these recommendations from the practical aspect. So thanks a lot, Mr. Ali, for joining us and sharing your on-ground experiences. We really got a deep insight into how the things work practically. And Professor Chaya told us how the things work more from the theoretical aspect, what laws we have written in our statute books, and Mr. Ali told us how those are implemented, how much of it is actually utilized, and what changes we need to make, and how those changes would help the officials like Mr. Ali on ground. So thanks a lot again, and thank you to all the participants for joining. If anyone has any question, you can put it forth in the chat box. But since I see no more questions, I hand it over to Madhura ma'am, and we could stop the YouTube live and also end the meeting. And thanks a lot again.
Sure, Sania ji. Thank you so much for such a wonderful event. Mr. Zishan, thank you for coming forward. And we'll end this event here. I'm just stopping the recording.